So this is a great topic for us to talk about. Every time that we start discussing sports muscle technology, the idea of plyometrics comes up, right? And the reality of it is most people don't understand what plyometrics are, right? When I look at plyometrics, I think of they're the most important part of returning an athlete to sports. We have to get them through doing some plyometrics to get them back to sports. And then it's also the most important or most beneficial or most practical way of improving athletic performance, right? But there's also kind of a more technical understanding.
Right. If you break down the word plyometric, right, what is that? Well, in Latin, plyo means jump, and metric is a measurement. So it's a jumping measurement, really, when you break the word down. But more importantly, when you quantify it, it's spinning less than 0.05 meters per second on the ground. We talk about coupling time, or the amortization phase of the jump. It's spinning as the least amount of time on the ground as possible, is really kind of the scientific derivation of it.
Which is very scientific, right? And that is where the problem comes in with training plyometrics. There's also another term called power metrics, which kind of is this all-encompassing idea of working on speed and change of direction, right? So when we think about what plyometrics are, they're really this idea of jumping and throwing, right? And where we're seeing this, we're moving in one direction, then rapidly changing direction, which is the main reason why it's so beneficial to sports, right? But when you look at injuries, that's the other reason, why plyometrics are so important, is because that's the part where we see the biggest deficit when coming back from an injury, is being able to rapidly change direction. Because whatever tissue is healing, it can't deal with those rapid, high speed forces, right?
Specifically
eccentrically, right? As we're changing direction, the body has to absorb that load, right? So the faster that you try to change direction, the more important your biomechanics are to be able to take that eccentric load and transfer it into the change of direction.
Which is where the sports muscle technology intro to plyometrics and the preparedness for plyometrics comes in, is to prevent those kind of injuries and get you prepared to do these movements.
Right, exactly. So because of these high rates of speed and force that is done during plyometrics, you see this huge performance benefit, right? You also see a huge strengthening component where, strength and conditioning sports scientists of the past had really recommended using plyometrics over a lot of weightlifting techniques, because plyometrics, when done correctly, can actually increase athletic strength and power better than weightlifting.
Right. And when you look online and try to find a presence of plyometrics, you don't really see it out there. I mean, people touch on it or they have it a part of their program, but there's no go-to for plyometrics, which is what sports muscle is trying to do.
And ultimately, coming back to that, this lack of understanding of how to program plyometrics into your rehab or into your training was the main reason I got into sports muscle technology from the beginning. Right? I knew that there was this hole. I knew that the programming behind it wasn't precise. I knew that it wasn't focused on skill acquisition in the neuromuscular system, right? And when we come into plyometrics, right, this is where we're having the fault, right? Is that we're not thinking about training the quality of the movement, right? Plyometrics are not just jumping. Right? It comes back to this scientific explanation that Taylor gave in how you're doing the jumping and how quickly you're changing direction or making that switch from one direction to the other. So this idea of the switch in the change of direction is inherent in every athletic movement that we're doing. So if we can enhance the ability to create that switch from one direction to the other, then we can enhance somebody's athletic ability. Right? Like Taylor was saying, what that requires is to make sure that the body is able to be prepared to do that switch the most efficiently without putting too much pressure on the joints and the ligaments and the tendons and the muscles. Because over time, through that training, if you're doing it incorrectly, if you're doing it with the wrong sequencing, the wrong body position, right, you're going to cause injuries, right? So the biggest thing that we've seen over the years is that really plyometrics have almost become this thing where nobody's talking about it because they think that it's going to cause more injuries. And that's because people aren't doing it correctly.
Another real important thing about plyometrics is the force production that's created by it. Now, more often than not, sport is all about the amount of force that you can apply to a surface. How do you push off the turf? How do you get off the wrestling mat? How do you throw a punch in the octagon? How do you throw a baseball on the sand mound, right? Beach volleyball on the sand, right? It's about the force you're applying to the surface. So going back to this idea of being proactive instead of reactive, why do we have athletes balancing on surfaces? It's never about what the surface does to your body. You're not worried about what the pool water is doing to your legs or what the sand is doing to your foot. It's all about applying the force to the surface and reacting. And that's what plyometrics does in essence.
And the interesting part is that it's not just about the force. It's not just about the quantitative part of it. It's about the quality, right? It's about how you're moving, right? Training plyometrics is really about training movement in the sequencing, because you can be very erratic, right? And create a lot of force.
Doesn't mean you're athletic.
Right. Doesn't mean you're athletic. And it also doesn't mean that you're under control, right? And in athletics, there's situations where you have to be reactive, right? And you have to move very quickly and change directions when you're out of control, right? That's another component to athleticism, right? But when we're looking at training plyometrics to get this functional transfer in the training, we want to make sure that the sequencing and the movement is very controlled, right? Because if you're doing these high speed, rapid, erratic, high force production movements and you're out of control, you're going to be at more risk for injury, as a basic thing, but also you're just not going to see the functional transfer that you're looking for in your performance, right? You just become more inefficient. We have this idea of proactive versus reactive stabilization, right? This idea of I am reacting and staying stiff and stable while I'm standing on an unstable surface, for example, right? Or I am running simply, right? My equilibrium has been disturbed and I have to still be able to control my balance and basically control my body mechanics. But as we get up to the elite levels in athletics, you really have to do both, right? You have to be able to control your body in space as you're moving proactively, and then also have the ability to react and change directions quickly and efficiently.
I would say that's the precipice of athleticism, is proactively reacting.
Right. And from a rehab standpoint, that's how we look at it, from the acute phase of you just blew your knee out and had surgery to rehabbing back the whole way to the point where you're actually ready to return to competitive athletics. We have this idea of returning to function, which is your normal life. Then we have this idea of returning to sports or athletics, which is where this preparation for plyometrics really comes in. Right? This preparation for high speed movements and change of direction. But now when we get into competition, we have all of these variables, right? We have the crowd, we have the referees, we have all of these players, we have balls and implements and rackets and all of these different things, time as well. You have the play that you're running, right? And you have these defenders that are also disrupting your path of movement. Right? So you have to combine this proactive and reactive training in a way that facilitates that, so the athlete is prepared to handle the rigors of their sport. So yeah, and as we're talking about, plyometrics are fairly, unknown to most people that are in fitness, right? Some athletes have some exposure to it, right? But what are some examples of what you see as plyometrics in, typical strength and conditioning or fitness?
I would say most people would say box jumps or ladder drills, hurdles.
And we'll also see medicine ball throwing. That's another really good example of what people are doing for upper body plyometrics. So I think a lot of times people think that plyometrics are only lower body exercises, right? So when you think about what plyometrics are, most of the time, what you can consider them is a higher speed version of a more basic movement. Like jumping is really a faster version of a squat. Right. For example, right? Yeah. So what most people, look at as plyometrics are these really explosive movements where you're throwing or kicking or punching or jumping. Right. And with that, again, when you have high speed movements, you're training movement. And I know I keep coming back to this, right? But one of the things that we have to be really careful with is that when we increase speed or we increase resistance or we increase somebody's fatigue, we end up seeing an awkwardness in their movement characteristics. right? As soon as we increase one of those three parameters, you're going to start getting into a situation where a person can not really control their body mechanics and they're going to become less coordinated. And that's why I keep harping on the idea of that we need to really focus on movement. And because of that, this is why the evaluation-based protocol is so important, because when we try to apply plyometrics, for example, to a group of athletes like football players, they're not all coming in with the same level of physical prerequisites, right? So they all can't do the same level of plyometric movements the same, right? So we should be looking at each individual athlete, particularly specifically for them, of what plyometric exercises we should be doing for them, right? Versus maybe doing a squat or a weighted squat with a barbell or using dumbbells for bench pressing or something along those lines. You can prescribe that for a group of athletes and this guy's going to use 35 pounds or 40 pounds. When it comes to plyometrics, if they don't have the preparedness and the physical prerequisites to actually execute on those movements correctly, you're going to have a problem.
Right. And again, that comes back to talking about not only understanding the movement, but the science behind it. A lot of coaches will program box jumps. Are box jumps plyometric? Well, they can be. It doesn't mean they are. If I tell you to do box jumps for reps and you're not doing them at the correct speed, that's not plyometrics. So you have to have the knowledge of the science and the movement together for it to be efficient.
Yeah. And that's what we end up seeing in CrossFit, right? They're basically conditioning this fast movement to the point of fatigue where somebody's body mechanics break down. And that's why you see so many injuries in CrossFit. The other place that we're seeing this is in this idea of contrast, right? Where somebody's using a strength exercise and then pairing it with a plyometric. So they're kind of getting the slow twitch muscle fiber and the fast twitch muscle fiber. But then a lot of times the plyometric exercise is done incorrectly, right? The sequencing and the body control and the movement isn't done correctly
from the strength.
Because they're fatigued. So you have to be even more careful with basically pairing your plyometric exercise up with your resistance exercise when you're doing contrast methods. And again, coming back to programming for plyometrics, most people aren't really that well versed in this because they're not well versed in the science of the biomechanics of these movements and the skill acquisition that's needed through this neuromuscular conditioning process.
If you found this content helpful, please do us a favor and follow us on YouTube, hit that like button, and comment if you have any questions.